Welcome to our discussion on Beowulf. So this is an introductory lecture to Beowulf. Start with this introductory line, drawn from Star Wars a long time ago in a mead hall far, far away. So we'll be talking about Beowulf. As I said, this is a background lecture on the book. We'll be discussing in about 2 weeks. So I want to start by talking about the period immediately prior to when the Beowulf story is actually being told. So this is not when it's written, but when Beowulf is supposedly occurring. So the historical context, as you see here from the map, this is the kind of the end of the classical era and the beginning of the medieval era. We draw the line here at the kind of the end of the Roman Empire. The end of when the Roman Empire was an effective organization. So the Roman Empire had been split into a western and an eastern half by the Emperor Diocletian in 286 CE. Throughout the 4th century, military expenses continued to drain resources from the empire, and whereas the Roman army had been exceptional in infantry tactics, horse cavalry became more and more important in warfare, reducing the tactical advantages of the traditional Roman legions. The defeat of the Roman army at Adrianople by the Goths destroyed much of what was left of the Western Roman army. And without a strong army to protect its borders, Gothic tribes began to migrate into Roman lands. These tribes coexisted and cooperated in some cases with Roman rule, and in some cases they just ignored it. Throughout this period, military incursions by Huns, Bulgars, Avars, Magyars were ongoing and terrorizing the citizens and disrupting life on the ever-shrinking Roman frontiers. By the end of the 5th century, many Roman institutions were crumbling. So, the early medieval period, we kind of draw the line between the late classical and the early medieval period. In about 476 CE, when the last Western Roman emperor, Romulus Augustulus, was deposed by the barbarian king Odoacer. The ouster of Augustulus represents the beginning of what is referred to sometimes as the Dark Ages, but now by scholars is generally referred to as the post-classical or medieval era, which is roughly the 5th century to the 5th century CE, depending on what country you happen to be looking at. As the Roman authority waned, the institutional structure that had governed life receded. Cities, literacy, and trading networks shrank back, and everything became ever more local and local-centric. Independent civilizations began to rise to fill the void left by the collapse of the Roman Empire. The period is characterized by stagnant economy, and stagnant science, as well as a declining population. The institutions of the Roman Empire that had sustained trade, economic development, and technological progress were falling apart. And most of this came to an end with the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. As trade diminished, economies became centralized on the manor, which was a self-contained economy with minimal trade. Wealth becomes tied to the amount of land that one could control, and the manor becomes a defensible castle. The Catholic Church is one of the few institutions that remained, and it provided some institutional structure, including some legal structure, such as ecclesiastical courts, throughout the period. So I want to point here to the area that Beowulf actually takes place, which is up here in the Scandinavian region. And you can see how far it is from the influence of the Roman Empire. So focusing in on Scandinavia. Scandinavia really was always outside of Roman control, but it benefited from trade with the Romans. Roman artifacts dating back throughout the span of the empire have been found throughout Scandinavia. So there's clearly Roman influence, but never Roman control. Something else that's important is the Goths, which is a tribe generally from this region, from the Scandinavian region, uh, engaged in a centuries-long cross-migration, first leaving from Scandinavia and migrating out of Scandinavia and south to the Black Sea, all the way to the Black Sea, around the 250 to 375 CE. They were ultimately pushed back out by Attila and the Huns around 400 CE, and then they were pushed further west back to where they originated from, around 600 CE. So this cross-migration would have been accompanied with a lot of raiding and violence, as well as cross-cultural melding. Beowulf Beowulf, using a modern map of Europe here, you can see, this is the area that Beowulf is operating in and the story takes place in, focusing in on a map that captures many of the tribes that are talked about in the Beowulf period, so circa 500 to 700 CE. You can see these are where the various tribes were, and at different times, Beowulf journeys and visits with other tribes, but he was known as a Geat. He refers to himself as a Geat in the poem. So Beowulf is really happening during the Vendel era, which is about 550 to 793 CE. Now, it's not really happening because it's just a folk tale, right? But scholars believe that the tale refers to the early part of the Vendel era. So you see here a helmet and a sword. The helmet is a lot like what's described that Beowulf wears when he goes into battle in the book. So again, the Beowulf story is speculated to have been timed during the early Vendel era. It's also known as the Germanic Iron Age. So this period saw the rise of Norse mythology. You're probably familiar with Thor from recent movies, but also Odin and the whole pantheon of Norse mythology. It's very fatalistic in nature. It focuses on a world coming to an end in a great cataclysm called Ragnarok. It's very warrior-centric. With this fatalism comes, a willingness to die. So great warriors go to Valhalla to fight and feast until the great Ragnarok, when not only do the heroes ultimately die, but so do the gods. So the central value of this culture is glory and heroism. Now, when you read Beowulf, what you're going to see or read is a number of references, Christian references. So if this was truly a story out of that period, Christian references would be, sort of like the clock chiming the hour in Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. There weren't any clocks, right? They had sundials. So, so it is, when you read it and you hear them make, Beowulf talking about Christian, different Christian images, you know that he would not be talking about that. So what you're seeing is a melding of cultures, right? An overlaying of cultures, and the fact that the actual story, though it is about this time long ago, right? It was actually written down around 1000 CE, and I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. But when you read these like Christian references, you'll realize that this is not something that a character actually living in that time would have said, right? These references would have been to the Norse mythology. Now, Christianity, of course, did exist, and it was moving in north, but it was not a dominant force in Beowulf's area of the world. So here we've got a little family tree. This gets a little confusing in the book as to, with all these odd names, and there's a lot of genealogy that's captured in the book, and so I thought I'd put this out here. So the Geats were Beowulf's clan, and known as a seafaring tribe residing in the south of Sweden. As the poem suggests, the Geats appear to have been conquered and disappeared into history. So at the very end of the book, not to give too much away, but near the end of the book, they anticipate being conquered. The seafaring Geats appeared to be the invading Danes, of whom Gregory of Tours writes concerning an attack on, I can't pronounce this, Cholochilaeus or something like that, against the Franks in 520. Later, they were connected to the Gautar people, who were eventually subjugated by the Swedes in the territory inland of Sweden. Given this history, Kleiber speculates that Beowulf himself was born around the year 495 CE. He defeats Grendel and his mother to save Hroðgar's kingdom around 515, and then following Hygelac's raid in 520, he eventually becomes the king of the Geats when Heardred was killed in 533. So the Geats are sometimes referred to as Geatas, Buo Geatas, which means war Geats, the Sai Geatas, which means sea Geats, or the Weder Geatas, which means the weather Geats. The Vendel era is generally considered to come to an end with the beginning of the Viking era, which is, and that's marked by a raid on the monastery of Lindisfarne, which is in northern Great Britain. So Viking culture is dated to about 793 CE to 1066 CE, beginning with the raid on the monastery. The incident is dramatically recorded in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles in the year of in the year 793. In this year, dire forewarnings, and it's got a lot of this next passage is a lot of kind of religious imagery. In this year, dire forewarnings came over the land of the Northumbrians and miserably terrified the people. These were extraordinary whirlwinds and lightnings, and fiery dragons were seen flying in the air. A great famine soon followed these omens, and soon after that, in the same year, on the 6th of the Ides of Lanner, the havoc of heathen men miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne through rapine and slaughter. A little more toned-down version comes from a book called The History of the Church of Durham by the monk Simeon. On the 7th of the Ides of June, they reached the church of Lindisfarne, and there they miserably ravaged and pillaged everything. They trod the holy things under their polluted feet. They dug down the altars and plundered all the treasures of the church. Some of the brethren they slew, some they carried off with them in chains. The greater number they stripped naked, insulted, and cast out of doors, and some they drowned in the sea. So following 793, what we see in Northern Europe is, and all across Europe really, is a 3 centuries of Viking raids and Viking exploration. So the Beowulf poet is writing toward the end of the Viking era. So his familiarity is with the Vikings, right? So his version of Beowulf will be influenced by his own knowledge of the Vikings, right? So he has these Beowulf stories, and so he's overlaying several things, right? He's overlaying Christian imagery, and then he's overlaying his own, real experience or observed experience with Vikings, which are related and come from the same area as Beowulf would have come from, but they are, this is again a later time period. So I want to switch gears here. We've been talking about kind of the historical. I want to talk a little bit about epic poetry, because that's, in fact, what Beowulf is. It is an epic poem. An epic is a long, often book-length narrative in verse that retells the heroic journey of a single person or group of persons. Elements that typically distinguish epics include superhuman deeds, fabulous adventures, highly stylized language, and a blending of lyrical and dramatic traditions. Many of the world's oldest written narratives are actually in epic form, including the Babylonian Gilgamesh, the Sanskrit Mahabharata, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, and Virgil's Aeneid. Ancient epic poem was generally written in rhyme and meter and was often sung, as implied by the Iliad and the Aeneid. The Iliad came from a pre-literate period in Greece where the performers would have had to memorize the entire poem, book-length poem, right? If you've ever read the Iliad, it's a long book. The poem is often has repeated standard descriptions to kind of make the whole piece easier to memorize. So it's easier to memorize if it's in rhyme. It's easier to memorize if you've kind of got these like standardized descriptions that you know. All right, it's almost like plugging in a module, right? So he uses, if as you read the Iliad, you'd be like, why is he describing, the sea as the wine dark sea? Why is he, and he does it every time. Why is he, describing the dawn as unfurling her arms? I forget the exact, it's because it's easier to memorize, because you're trying to memorize this whole book. And so if you can kind of turn it into modules, it's easier to remember all those things. But again, some special language. So I've got a few selections from some of these Phamic epics that I want to share with you to kind of give you a sense of, what are we going to read in Beowulf? What kind of language would you expect to hear? And so it's this tradition. So this is from Gilgamesh, the opening of Gilgamesh, the oldest known poem in that was recorded in human history. So and it was recorded around 2100 BCE. So it opens like this. He who has seen everything, I will make known to the lands. I will teach about him who experienced all things. Alike, Anu granted him the totality of knowledge of all. He saw the secret, discovered the hidden. He brought information of the time before the flood. He went on a distant journey, pushing himself to exhaustion, but then was brought to peace. So you can see this is an opening of a big story, right? It's not going to be some little, he went to the store and picked up, milk and bread, right? This is going to be a big event. The Iliad, the opening of the Iliad, dates back to about 800 BCE. This is Greek now. Rage. Goddess, sing the rage of Peleus' son Achilles, murderous, doomed, that cost the Achaeans countless losses, hurling down to the house of death so many sturdy souls, great fighters' souls, but made their bodies carrion. Feasts for the dogs and birds, and the will of Zeus was moving towards its end. Begin, muse, when the two first broke and clashed, Agamemnon, lord of men, and brilliant Achilles. The Aeneid, so I'll share a short piece from the Aeneid. The Aeneid was written by Virgil, and it was Virgil's effort to try to kind of create a mythical past for Rome. And what he tries to do is, because the Romans were so infatuated with the Greeks, what he does is he tries to tie Roman history into Greek history, and specifically, he comes up with this character Aeneas, who was supposedly one of the defenders of Troy, who escapes Troy and leaves and goes on to found Rome ultimately. So the opening of the Aeneid. I sing of arms and the man, he who, exiled by fate, first came from the coast of Troy to Italy and to Lavinian shores, hurled about endlessly by land and sea, by the will of the gods, by cruel Juno's remorseless anger, long suffering also in war, until he founded a city and brought his gods to Latium. From that the Latin people came, the lords of Alba Longa, the walls of noble Rome. Muse, tell me the cause. How was she offended in her divinity? How was she grieved, the queen of heaven, to drive a man, noted for virtue, to endure such dangers, to face so many trials? Can there be such anger in the minds of gods? So again, big events are going to happen, right? This is not, the opening of some small thing. So the tradition continues, and I'd like to read a little bit from Dante, the opening of Dante's Inferno, which is also an epic. And the Inferno is written in about the 14th century, and it marks the end of the Middle Ages and the beginning of the Renaissance, in particular in Italy, right? And I said earlier, the end of the Middle Ages depends on where you were. And it ended earlier, generally speaking. The Italian Renaissance kind of took off earlier. You could talk about why that would be. A lot of it would be, like I talked about last time, Italy was trading with the Islamic Empire, and so they had kind of more opportunity to work with more advanced societies, and so that's a big part of why it happened in Italy. Um, uh, so the writing, Dante's writing, really kind of represents a very different cultural epic, but it still fulfills the purpose of the epic. Um, so this is the opening of the Inferno. Midway upon the journey of our life, I found myself within a forest dark, for the straightforward pathway had been lost. Ah me, how hard a thing it is to say, what was this forest savage, rough and stern, which in the very thought renews the fear. So bitter is it, death is little more, but of the good to treat, which there I found, speak will I of the other things I saw there. I cannot well repeat how there I entered, so full was I of slumber at the moment in which I had abandoned the true way. And so if you've read the Inferno or heard about the Inferno, what he does is he goes down into hell and explores hell. And who's his guide? Virgil, right? So we tie back to the Aeneid, right? Who's the greatest Roman author? Well, of course, it was Virgil. So some critics, contemporary critics, wonder at the disappearance of the epic form today from poetry today. Today, much poetry is dominated by short-form writing that does not dare to take on the scope of the epic poem. The epic poem is an attempt by the author to answer the really big questions. What is the meaning of life? How should I lead my life? And these are not questions that can be answered in 10 or 15 lines. There's a certain arrogance you have to believe that you can write an epic, and answer those kind of questions, right? But it seems, when I think, I don't have it here, but John Milton, Paradise Lost, is generally regarded, I think, as the greatest epic in English, in the English language. I don't have a quote from that. The Beowulf poem is an epic, and it does try to answer life's big questions. How should one live one's life? What is important? What really matters? What does it all ultimately mean? So now let me talk specifically a little bit about Beowulf. So why is Beowulf important? Well, first of all, Beowulf is the oldest surviving epic poem in the English language and the earliest piece of vernacular European literature. So much of, if you're familiar with how language and literature evolved during this period, right? There was if you were a educated person, what language did you write in that period? In 1000 AD, Latin, right? Everybody, if you were writing anything worth writing down, you were writing in Latin, right? And so there was a lengthy problem of transitioning, of the various cultures kind of establishing and reestablishing themselves, and using their own vernacular, using their own language. So Dante writes in Italian, and is one of the first, he's a serious author writing in the vernacular. And that kind of is like, well, that's not done, right? If you're going to write something serious, you write it in Latin, right? But Dante breaks that tradition, right? In Italian, well, Beowulf is written in Old English, and depending on which translation you get, I recommend the Seamus Heaney translation, but you don't have to use that one. But there are many like this, where you have on the left side of the page, you'll have the Old English, and on the right side of the page, you'll have a translation into modern English. And I'll tell you that, looking at the Old English it's more like looking at German, right, than it is like looking at English. The Old English uses a lot of German construction. Anyway, so much of it is, we have evolved. Our English language has evolved dramatically since then, but it is written in English or in Old English rather than in Latin, which is interesting. It was the particular version of Old English was the language of the Saxons. The poem was originally untitled until in 19th century the poem began to be called by the name of its Scandinavian hero, whose adventures are the primary focus. Historical elements run through the poem, yet both the hero and the story are fiction. I had a wonderful English teacher in high school who used to say, fiction is a lie that tells the truth. I think that's a neat way to think about it. And so as we kind of, so why do we read fiction? Well, because it takes the complexity and chaos of real life and it tries to find order, right? Beowulf is a story, but it resonated with the people of the 10th century because it spoke to some deeper truth about their existence. By reading the story, we can begin to understand what it was that concerned those people, what they valued, what they feared, and what they aspired to. Homer, likewise, was read by the Greeks of the classical age, but they read it as an ideal that had already long passed. Right? They saw the great men, Agamemnon and Achilles and and Odysseus as people who once upon a time existed, but where none of us can really hold a candle to those guys, right? A lot, maybe like we think of, the founding fathers, right? And the kind of how great they were, and gosh, I wish we could have another president that was like Washington or something, right? So it's that same kind of that's the framing of Beowulf, right there. It's written in 1000 BCE, CE, right, about a time 300, 400 years past. Okay, so, and the people who are reading it at that time or sharing it at that time know this is about a long time ago in a far off land, right? But they're still trying to get something out of this, right? It's told from the perspective of the people of 1000 CE, which is why, again, you've got all this Christian imagery and things that obviously Beowulf, had he existed, would not have known about or referenced. So the poem probably had similar origins as the Homeric epics, folk tales that emerged over hundreds of years, evolving with the telling. And like Homer's epics, it was composed in a time hundreds of years after the supposed events took place. The poem, as I said, is supposed to take place sometime between 500 and 700 CE, but was probably first told around 800 CE. Popular literature is replete with repeating plots and themes, as you can see from the images I have got up here. Some of these stories are truly timeless and can be told over and over again in different ways, right? They are essentially reboots, right? As I think the popular term is now, talking about, taking a story and retelling it. So, Beowulf is really a Middle Ages piece, and that's my point, right? It's not a it is a piece from the late Viking era, the beginning of towards the end of the Middle Ages. It captures the political and social conditions of medieval Scandinavia. It would have been sung rather than recited, most likely to musical accompaniment by a bard who would have been called a scop. It's spelled S-C-O-P, but it's actually pronounced shop. It's likely the audience would have known the story and the whole story, right? So just like if you go to see Little Mermaid or one of those, you know the story, so it's just kind of like, how's this going to be told this time, right? Or Spider-Man, right, for the 47th time. Okay, he gets bitten by a spider and then he learns all this stuff, right? We all know the story, but how well is it told? That's what you're going to see, right? I'm going to see Spider-Man again. Let's see how they do it this time, right? Or Batman, right? I mean, there's been 4 or 5 different Batman movies that they kind of reboot the whole thing again and again and again. And it's cool, right? We like that because what we're there for, we know the story, but what we're there for is to see the artistic, telling, right? So over time, people would have gone, they would have said, hey Bard, tell us the story about Beowulf, right? And we all know the story, so we're going to judge you on how well you spin it. Okay? It's likely that the audience would have known the story and all its allusions, and the shop would have been judged on how well he sang the story and wove in the music. It's kind of like going to see Shakespeare performed. Everybody knows the story of Romeo and Juliet. You probably even, you've probably read it several times. And so what you're really there to see is, well, how well do the actors and the director interpret the play and make it fresh again, right? So it's likely that eventually the poem was written down as an adaptation of these folk tales, putting more emphasis on Christian mythology. So, as you prepare to read the book and prepare for the discussion, um, I'd like you to focus on some of these, at least think about some of these questions. You can incorporate them into your writing, or you can, write about whatever you think is important from the story. But things I'm thinking about as I read it. What does it mean to be a leader? There's actually a lot of discussion about that, right? What does it mean? How does Beowulf instruct us to live? There's actually a fair amount of discussion about what's the good life in this story. What does a leader value? Right? You pay attention. What does he do? What does he keep for himself? What does he give away? Um, uh, what does society value about a leader? Right? There's a lot of discussion about, well, Bob was a really good leader, and Jack, he wasn't so great, and there's a lot of discussion about that in the book. And then finally, I'd like you to think about the relationship between storytelling and leadership. Uh, there are many stories told in Beowulf, and stories within stories. I've heard it said that human beings are unique not because they are tool-using animals, as I think Aristotle defined us, uh, but because we are storytelling animals. No other animal tells stories, at least that we're aware of. Maybe whales, I don't know. But we certainly can't understand them. So Beowulf is a story from more than 1,000 years ago. Does it have anything to tell us? That's the question. Or is it just an interesting artifact, useful for understanding another time? Okay, that's it for the... Any questions?